There's a slight deviation before I get into what I promised in terms of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, another development that happens in the 19th century that has an effect on defining one of the movements that I'm going to be talking about, and that is fundamentalism. And one of the defining features of fundamentalism, as it came to be known, was its millenarianism. I know that's another big millenarianism. M-I-L-L-E-N Arianism. Okay? This is the belief in a millennium, in the coming millennial kingdom. Now, this is nothing new. The Puritans talked about the millennium, believe it or not, and others have talked about the millennium even further back. But it became prominent in the 19th century from the teaching of one individual in particular, a fellow named John Nelson Darby. And we're back into Ireland this time. Darby is Irish. And Darby wasn't the founder of the Plymouth Brethren. If you've ever, some of you might have heard of the Plymouth Brethren, but he was a very prominent individual in starting the Plymouth Brethren, a small denomination. But what he's best known for, Darby is best known for, is his teachings on the end times, although he wrote like 52 very large volumes that nobody reads too much anymore. But his teaching on the end times came to be known as dispensationalism. And dispensationalism and millenarianism had a very large effect on fundamentalism. So very briefly, dispensationalism actually was, I say, from Darby's teaching, but it was promoted in the States through a network of churches. Some of them, by the way, were Presbyterians, some Baptists, so it wasn't just a particular denomination. It was promoted in the States through what came to be known as the Bible Conference movement. The Bible Conference movement actually had started again in England, where they just started gathering for these conferences on the estate of one of the noble families, titled families in England. And then people started having these Bible conferences in the States. A fellow named James Brooks, who is a Presbyterian pastor in St. Louis, started something. One of the most famous Bible conferences was the Niagara Conferences. So he's in St. Louis, but he starts this conference, others in Niagara, the Niagara Conferences at the Niagara Falls. And these were conferences that basically started out as just Bible conferences. As a brand new thing. I mean, we're having a conference now. We have conferences, different sorts of conferences, the Shepherd's Conference and other conferences today. But it goes back to this. This was the first big, large-scale, organized conference, basically nationwide. That's when the nation basically was from the Mississippi back east. A lot of those speakers brought up these dispensational themes. They talked about the end times. They talked about the kinds of things that we're all familiar with, if we're familiar with end time study, and particularly defending the fact of a rapture, but not necessarily arguing over the timing of it. That wasn't a big deal then. And the fact of a 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth, a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. So these kinds of teachings became prominent at these conferences. One of the individuals that was a regular speaker at these conferences, at the Niagara Conference, and by the way, then that spawned other conferences too that we don't need to talk about necessarily, but one of the big name speakers there was a guy named Cyrus Ingerson Scofield. Some of you might remember the Scofield, probably your generation, my generation, the new Scofield Reference Bible, but there was an old Scofield Reference, the granddaddy of all study Bibles, and the Scofield Reference Bible popularized dispensationalism because it was the first Bible where you had some notes. Think of the old King James Version with a lot of words in there you can't pronounce and never use. What the Scofield did, one of the first Bibles that do this, it took out those, didn't give you a new translation, just took out the really ancient words that nobody knew what they meant and put in a modern word there. And it had a way of identifying that. So it made it easier to read the Bible. And then it had notes, again at the bottom, explanatory notes that we're all familiar with any number of study Bibles. I think the Hello Kitty study Bible is coming out soon, but I don't think I'll be getting that one. But nevertheless, we got them for everything. But nevertheless, that was a unique thing. And it had things like introductions, and it had something of an outline. It was really helpful to people. It became very popular. In fact, just a little anecdote, it was published by Oxford Press. And the popularity of the Scofield, the old Scofield reference edition, the new Scofield reference edition was 1967, but the old Scofield, which went through basically a couple editions, but it kept Oxford Press afloat during the Great Depression, because people stopped buying other books, but they kept buying the Bible. And the Oxford Press, in its own history, acknowledges the fact that it sold. And it was just wildly popular. And this goes, by the way, to the question about ecumenism, because everybody, different denominations, were reading the Scofield Reference Bible. In the Scofield Reference Bible, there were some things that were like, not so good. But again, it was this millenarianism that was taught there. So again, it got to the point where conservative evangelicals in the early years of the 20th century, you could almost add a fifth to the five defining words of evangelicalism. You could add a fifth one, millenarianism, because it became very popular. And as we go on, we'll talk a little bit more about this. I think that becomes, again, one of the defining elements of the fragmenting of even fundamentalism into different branches, including neo-evangelicalism, but that's going to be for after lunch, I think, yeah. So what was happening then at the end of the 20th century, as we were just finishing with, we're talking about the fact that this revivalism had sort of downplayed biblical doctrine and elevated emotional responses. It had sort of decreased the importance of doctrinal clarity, and at the same time, liberal theology was developing a sort of theological basis for this. So this is the part that begins hard to imagine, and that is that, well, how did liberal theology get into evangelicalism? Because we're not talking about a rival movement that could say, that said, "Here I am, I'm a rival movement." It's like the devil never shows up in a red bodysuit with a pitchfork in his hand and puts his cloven hoof on the pulpit and says, "Here I am, I'm the devil." He comes as what? As an angel of light. Sounds good. So liberal theology comes in to an environment in which people are ready to believe that there is, emotionalism, and this is more important than Bible precision. At the same time that you have developments like Darwin's theories are being, publishing in the 1860s, The Descent of Man, and books like that touting evolution, and people are starting to question the Bible. Again, without doctrinal convictions, you got people saying you should question these things. Reason tells you to question these things. That's coming from the secular culture, while at the same time, a theology is coming that says, and you don't need to worry about that because you still can trust the Bible for what it does for your feelings and what it teaches you about morals. And that was beginning to infect the different denominations. By this time, the denominations, particularly, we're going to talk about two in particular, the Baptists and the Presbyterians. Now, what's difficult, again, sometimes for us to think as we think back on this, was that you had people sitting in the same pews, sitting in the same church, part of the same denomination, some of whom believed every word of the Bible is true, it's inspired, it's inerrant, I should believe it, and you had people that didn't believe that and thought that the essence of the faith was this sort of liberal idea of feelings and the morals that the Bible could teach. I think because we have grown up in an era that it isn't quite as tight in terms of our denominational affiliation, it's hard to understand how these people felt like, well, we're Baptists. You believe this way, we believe that way, but we're still Baptists. Or we're Presbyterians. You have this idea about the Bible, we have that idea about the Bible, but we're all still Presbyterians. It's like you can't not be Presbyterian even if you have these divergent ideas. Well, how are we going to live with one another that way? How are we going to do church with one another that way? It was hard for them to sort of foresee, after what happens in the fundamentalism modernist controversy, how that's all going to shake out. They just couldn't see it, if that makes any sense. And so what was happening was they were having these internal debates. The Baptists had their debates over the same issues. Specific issues were a little different, as did the Presbyterians. So just as an example, this tension between those that were the Bible-believing Christians and the more liberal Christians, both in the same denomination, creating that sort of tension, it flared up in a couple of different ways. For one thing, it flared up in terms of, think about this, how we're going to define conversion. How do you know somebody should be? What does it take? Do you have to be genuinely converted and born again in order to be a member of the church? Now, some of this goes back even further that I can't get into the weeds on, but it came to a real crisis. How are we all going to be Baptists if some of us think the way to be Baptist is to believe these things? So there was an effort in terms of seeing if they couldn't reduce their doctrinal statements down to a minimum, and then to state their doctrinal statements in such a way that both sides could affirm it, even though they meant different things by the words. And they tried that for a while, and it worked for a while. So you read it this way, I'll read it that way. I mean, talk about postmodernism, and they were trying something like that even there. And it's surprising that there was actually a third group. So you got the hardcore Bible believers, you got the people that are flat-out liberals, and then you got what I've called the mushy middle. And the mushy middle was the largest group. And the mushy middle was Baptist before anything, or Presbyterian before anything. And the mushy middle just didn't want to see the two, we have to get along. And so the mushy middle they were the ones that constructed these statements to say, well, how can I say this that you'll both agree? And they knew they didn't agree, but they could look at the words differently. By the way, have you ever sort of seen this phenomenon maybe in some different place, people trying to come up with a statement that everybody can agree on, but they don't both agree on it. It's kind of a phony sort of thing, but it was the mushy middle thought that they could get away with that. Well, surprisingly, at the beginning of this controversy between the two sides, these two sides I'll give the name, fundamentalist and modernist and mushy middle. When this started out, we're trying to all stay together. We're all trying to be Baptist. We're all trying to be Presbyterian. When it started out, they thought they could pull it off. But there was one side that just wouldn't let it go. Which side do you think was the side that just wouldn't let it go? It was the modernists that wouldn't let it go. It was the modernists that said, no, the fundamentalists were willing to go along with the mushy middle and say, okay, we know what it really says, so we'll hold it and it'll be the real thing. It was the modernists that said, nope, we're not going to be satisfied until everybody comes along with us. Footnote, does that sound familiar to you about what's happening in our culture? All right? We could sort of say, okay, we'll be tolerant. No, we won't allow your kind of tolerance. You must agree with everything we think is right. You have to go along with us. And since the conservatives weren't the largest party, and the mushy middle said, okay, let's keep moving in the direction of these people over here, that's how the drift kept happening. So the doctrinal statements kept getting watered down more and more, and the other side was pushing. As an example of the fact that it was the modernists were the ones that kept pushing it, probably the quintessential modernist was a guy named Harry Emerson Fosdick, F-O-S-D-I-C-K, Harry Emerson Fosdick, who ironically, talk about sort of how this thing gets convoluted. Fosdick was a Baptist, but was preaching in a Presbyterian church in New York. So, I mean, and how could somebody who's Baptist actually preach? Baptists, just in case you don't know it, don't baptize babies. and Presbyterians do baptize babies, and their pastor was a Baptist who wouldn't baptize the babies. How do you get along? Well, because they were modernists before they were either Baptist or fundamentalist. And his most famous sermon that he preached was, "Shall the fundamentalists win?" They were the guys that said, no, we don't want them to win. We don't want the fundamentalists to win. Part of this, by the way, was because the denominations were big, they were powerful, they had money, they had influence, and the modernists wanted that. They didn't want the fundamentalists to have any of that prestige. They didn't want them to have any of that power within the denomination, and they certainly didn't want them to have the money. This showed up sometimes in terms of like missionary budgets, where you'd have a liberal or a modernist missionary that would be supported by the whole denomination, and if the fundamentalists objected to that, this happened in the Presbyterians, if they objected to that, then the mushy middle and the modernists would basically, squelch the objections of the fundamentalists. This happened in the Presbyterian movement. Have you ever heard of a woman named Pearl S. Buck? Probably as an author, but she was originally a missionary, and she was a modernist missionary. She didn't go out to do conversions. She went out to do sociology, and was supported by the Presbyterian Church in order to do this sort of thing. Anyway, the point was that this came to be a problem for the fundamentalists. As this pressure grew more and more on them to conform, they found it less and less possible for them to conform and still hold on to their convictions. Now, this is still an era in which they can't imagine not being Baptist. And not being Baptist in this one big Baptist church, or not being Presbyterian in this one big Presbyterian church. So what are the fundamentalists going to do? Well, they start pushing back. They start pushing back against the drift in the seminaries, for instance. The seminaries of the 5 Baptist seminaries were all drifting toward modernism, and they started pushing back, and they said we need to stop this. And so they started bringing lawsuits within the context of the church, not civil lawsuits, that needed to be debated at their national convention. And they said, this guy's a heretic. He's teaching something that's not true in the Bible. He's teaching something that's false. So they tried to force the hand of the seminaries to fire professors that were teaching that the Bible couldn't be trusted. And they made some successes, but they had mostly failures. And these people kept, even if they've got a professor fired from a seminary because his doctrine was not true to the Bible, guess what? Just go to another seminary, and you just keep teaching over there. You never could really sort of like whack-a-mole. You couldn't really just get rid of these guys. So, and the same with the Presbyterians. They passed resolutions. You have to believe in the virgin birth. You have to believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. You have to believe in the stories of the Bible are literal, like Jonah or Jesus' miracles. And you have to believe that he's risen bodily from the dead. And the Presbyterian, the whole assembly, the convention, passed. You have to believe these things if you're going to teach in one of our seminaries. And then the seminaries just didn't. They just let these guys keep teaching. It's sort of like passing a resolution in California to raise money for the roads to improve the highways, and the governor says, "Oh, we'll put it into climate change research instead." It's my wife's favorite objection to these kind of things. Not to be political here, but you get the point. Because they just again, it was the modernists that kept pushing the issue and just wouldn't relent, and the mushy middle just kept going along. Finally, one issue in particular comes to the head, and that's the issue of the origin of man. There are a lot of other issues, but if you just pick one issue, you could say literal interpretation of Genesis, or you could say the question of Darwinism as just the thing that we have to say no. We have to say no to that. We can't believe that men evolved from apes and still believe in the truth of what the Bible teaches. It's in so many doctrinal areas. So it was at that area, it was that issue that then becomes one of the, and I don't want to overplay that. There were other issues that they brought up, but that was like the issue kind of everybody knew was the one. We've drawn the line in the sand. We will not let you accommodate the understanding that we evolved from a lower creature in your interpretation of the Bible. That's just not going to be acceptable. So what the fundamentalists did, by the way, they didn't know they were fundamentalists yet. I keep using that term. It's a little anachronistic. We don't get to be fundamentalists until the next page of my notes. But the people that were the conservatives, well, here's where the term comes from. So the first development, there were a number of big developments where the fundamentalists sort of responded. And the first big development was the fundamentals. I'm not just repeating myself. The fundamentals. The fundamentals was the title of a series of booklets, really, that were produced in the first couple of decades, actually from 1910 to 1915, by Lyman Stewart and his brother Milton, who were, quote, Southern California oil millionaires. Didn't know we had oil in Southern California. Where are we drilling for oil in Southern California? Yeah, I mean, I'm drill, baby, drill, okay? I think we should drill for oil. I think if we don't drill all the oil before the Antichrist comes, leaving one drop of oil for him to use is a travesty. It's like Glenn Beck said, I'd drill right through the head of a caribou to get some more oil, if they would bring prices down. But they were oil men. I know, I've heard that they did research, and you would be more productive by drilling on Catalina Island than any other place in Southern California. Because, you're already offshore, right? So that's where it would go. Think we're ever going to see oil derricks on Catalina Island? Yeah. Actually, I think what they do is just take a picture of Catalina Island, put it on a giant poster, post that on the eastern side of the island, so that's what people would see, and then drill anyway. So you could see what it used to look like. But in any case, California oilmen, I've always thought that was odd. What they did is they sponsored these pamphlets to promote biblical doctrine. And so a number of them had all kinds of things, an article promoting virgin birth or defending virgin birth, an article promoting biblical inerrancy, and a number of articles promoting biblical views of origins, the creation of man, and debunking Darwinism. And these went out all over the country. In fact, these guys, they produced thousands of them and gave them away free. They sent them to again, didn't make any difference because they didn't know who was a conservative and not. They went to every Presbyterian preacher, they went to every Baptist preacher, they went to every place they possibly could go. One of the people that was instrumental in helping to develop and edit this was a guy named R.A. Torrey, Reuben A. Torrey. Reuben Torrey was the first, actually D.L. Moody, who I mentioned earlier, was the first president of the Moody Bible Institute, really a name only. Then R.A. Torrey was the second president, but then R.A. Torrey came out here and started another place, a Bible Institute in Los Angeles, whose name then became Biola, but now is just Biola. See, I've even got people today that think Biola must have been the guy that founded it, because they think that's just a name. And I tell them that's an acronym, Bible Institute of Los Angeles. They said, "Oh, that's clever. It's interesting that his name matches up with that." No, that's what it was. But he came out there and he helped to start that. But he helped to develop these production of these fundamentals, as they were called. They tried a couple of different editions of them, but it was the first one that everybody went out. Well, it had two effects. The first obviously, it gave the name of this group. They haven't picked it up just yet, but you know where it's coming. And the second thing it did was it clarified the divide between the two groups. So now we've got something we say, okay, it's not just this drift toward different things. Here it is. These are the fundamentals. If you're not going to believe every one of these, if you're not on board with every one of these, then that means you are over there. It was really not a challenge to the modernists, because they knew the modernists were not going to, be persuaded by any of these. It was a challenge to the mushy middle. You have to choose. These are the fundamentals. You have to decide, are you with us or are you with them? Well, not to get into my story, but it worked, but it didn't. It showed where the divide was, but the mushy middle went with the modernists, most of them. Well, that wasn't the only thing they did. Another thing that the fundamentalists did was they started something called the World Christian Fundamentals Association, a very cumbersome name, in 1919. They had a conference, because again, they were familiar with having conferences. And again, they set out the fundamentalist platform. This is what we believe. You can see what's happening here is that it's almost like they were awakened to the notion of trimming the doctrinal statement so everybody can get on board. Isn't working. The drift keeps going. So they said, okay, let's stop that. Let's say this is what we believe. This is where we're going to stand. And they kept doing that at the World's Christian Fundamentals Association. They said, this is what we believe. And they also said, this is what we reject. So we clearly reject modernism. We clearly reject Darwinism. We clearly reject anti-biblicism. And by the way, just for good measure, we clearly reject some of these social developments, going back to the social gospel that I mentioned, some of those kinds, because the liberals have picked up on those. We clearly reject those as well. Now, I'm trying to be fair here, but the point is that be careful when you're drawing a line and say, this is what we affirm, all good. But when you start telling about what you reject, now you have to be real careful in what you're saying you reject. Because we don't want, as Christians, to be known for what we reject. We want to be known for what we affirm. But that's the pattern that they started there. Okay, they rejected evolution. That's good. They rejected a number of other sorts of things. Well, another development among liberalism was happening too, and that was the idea of a federation of churches, a federation of like-minded churches, again, beyond denominational lines. And long story short, here they started something called the Federal Council of Churches that you probably know becomes the World Council of Churches and that sort of thing. So, if the fundamentalists can all get together cross-denominationally, we're going to get together cross-denominationally, and they started that. What's funny is that never became as influential as the consolidation of fundamentalist churches. But what it did do is, again, what the fundamentalists were trying to do is say, that's not us. So the fundamentalists now had something to say, okay, you're going to start a liberal group, we won't join it. Take that. But at least it defined who they were. So it went the other way. Well, till now, the point is that you had these efforts at fundamentalism, but I'm going to sort of draw it down to one particular individual. And that one particular individual that became sort of the face of fundamentalism, surprisingly, was a guy named J. Gresham Machen. Machen's story, long story short, is Machen was a professor at Princeton Seminary. Princeton Seminary started going south. Remember I said, Harvard, then Yale, then it's Princeton. Now Princeton starts going south. And Machen's at Princeton Seminary and says, I'm not going south with you. And he starts writing, articles against this liberalism. In fact, he wrote the book, Christianity and Liberalism. And it's still in print today. And I still recommend it to my students today. And so this dividing that I was talking about, that these fundamentals and the Fundamental Association was trying to accomplish, Machen comes in. Surprisingly, Machen didn't want to be called a fundamentalist. Because one thing, he wasn't a millenarian, so he didn't believe in dispensationalism. He was a Presbyterian. He was a pretty conservative Southern Presbyterian guy. But Machen writes this book, Christianity and Liberalism, and the thesis of this book is really stark. And it's one of the things, again, if we read it now, knowing what we know in hindsight, we go, okay, that's good. But you have to understand, again, in that environment, this landed like a bombshell. This was a guy not just drawing a line in the sand, he was drawing a ditch in the sand, filling it with concrete, okay, and putting dogs on either side, on the one side to make sure that they didn't get over, okay? Razor wire. That's this book, okay? And basically the thesis is this: Christianity is one religion and liberalism is an entirely different religion. Now, again, go back to where I started this hour when I said, you really couldn't, the Baptists and the Presbyterians were in a denomination and they just couldn't see themselves any other way. I mean, you're Baptist, you're Presbyterian, even though you got these two different points of view. The fundamentalists are responding to the modernists who keep pushing the issue, and Machen comes along and says, let's just face it. You can call yourself a Baptist, but you're in a different religion. Think about it, a different religion. That's not even Christianity. And because he was very scholarly and very ironic about it, very, nice about it, put it nicely but strongly, he couldn't be denied. And that wedge is this then what started, cracking everything. So it was very difficult. Indeed, it was impossible to deny that we had two different groups. Unfortunately, as I already said, Princeton Seminary was going south, so what Machen had to do was go start another seminary. The constant theme in all of this is that no matter what the fundamentalists did to try and say, look, here's the divide, we're Christianity, you're not, we're faithful to the Bible, you're not, and what tried to do, it was clear they were never going to win the denominations. They were going to lose. They're going to lose the seminaries, they're going to lose the denominations. No matter how clearly they divided things, the more clearly they divided things, it was clear more people moved from the mushy middle over to the modernist side. And it was inevitable of what was going to happen. Then the quintessential event happened that sort of said, that's it. That fundamentalism is going to have to be completely divided away from the denominations. And it didn't happen, ironically, it didn't happen within the context of the church. It happened outside the church. In fact, it happened in the most unlikely place you possibly can imagine, in Dayton, Tennessee, which is literally, you can't get there from here. I mean, it was even then, it was a wide spot in the road. It was not a big place. But because Tennessee had passed a law that said you cannot teach Darwinism, that's, again, the fundamentalists thought political. Think about this, folks. A political solution. That's what we'll do. We'll make it illegal to teach Darwinism. Yeah, that'll work, right? Well, what happened, of course, is the so-called monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And if you've ever watched the movie Inherit the Wind, you have no idea how that trial actually went down. Okay, that's the liberals making a movie of the Scopes monkey trial going on. Entertaining movie, completely beside the point. In fact, most people don't know this, but the fundamentalists won in the court. But they lost in the court of public opinion, big time. What happened was, of course, that William Jennings Bryan, who had run for president a couple of times, maybe 3 by this point, and had not been successful, he was a Democrat, was the prosecutor of this fellow, this young man, Scopes, who had, by the way, had been solicited by the ACLU. He was a substitute teacher, and he'd been solicited and said, hey, the next time you get the chance to teach, go teach evolution. I think it was an economics class. And he goes in and teaches the evolution there, just so that he could get arrested, just so they could have a trial, just so they could have all this. But anyway, one author says the scene at Dayton was unsurpassably a confirmation of the interpretation that fundamentalism was backward-looking, anti-intellectual, reactionary, old-fashioned, out-of-date, Victorian, rural, unsophisticated. That's pretty much a description of me and my upbringing in Iowa. So it was actually more of a circus than anything else. And of course, another movie that I wouldn't recommend, but the Elmer Gantry type manifestations that are of depictions of the fundamentalists were again sort of very much in evidence. And here's what the problem was. I'll make this shorter. The courtroom was it was calm. It was a courtroom. People had things back and forth. Out in the streets, it was the zoo was going on all around them. And the reporters could have reported what was going on in the courtroom, or they could report the manifestation. By the way, do you think the news skews things a little bit? I mean, you feel like you're never quite getting the real story when you're watching the news. Here's a clue: you're not. Okay, I've often said, whenever I see a news story about something I happen to know about, do you ever have this sensation? Something, maybe an accident you saw or some event that you actually witnessed, and then you hear it reported on TV, and you go, well, yeah, that kind of an event happened, but they're not getting it right, But so then you trust all the other stories that they put on the news, okay? It's not. But anyway, the aforementioned H.L. Mencken, the guy that I talked to you about, that Puritans are guys who don't like having fun. H.L. Mencken was a reporter for the Baltimore newspaper, but he actually got a job as a broadcaster for a Chicago radio station, WGN, and they were broadcasting the reports directly from this. Machen hated fundamentalism. He was a modernist through and through. He hated fundamentalism. At one time he said, this country is so full of fundamentalists, you can't pitch an egg out of a Pullman car without hitting a fundamentalist somewhere. He hated them. And he skewed it so that it made it look like William Jennings Bryan was a buffoon. His arguments were incoherent. It's not the case. And that Clarence Darrow, the guy that was the defendant, was brilliant and was twisting. I mean, the movie will give you the impression that William Jennings Bryan just, lost it and was a buffoon. Not the case. Even Darrow himself at the end of it said, we had no case. He violated the law. There was no way we were going to win. They prosecuted him, fined him $100. But the point is that what went out in terms of the media characterized fundamentalism in such a bad light. It's hard to describe. Again, this was through radio, a fairly new medium. It's hard to describe the effect that this had on the whole country and the estimate that they had on fundamentalists. From that point on, there was no recovering the public face of fundamentalism. They were buffoons. They were backward. They were anti-intellectual, as I said. And so what happened was fundamentalism said, okay, fine. After this, fundamentalism said, look, they gave up on trying to save the denominations. They gave up on trying to, articulate a defense of fundamentalism outside of their own circles, and they divided up into three groups at this time. There are three groups of the fundamentalists. So now you can see how this is fragmenting. So we've got the fundamentalist, the mushy middle, who moves toward modernism, or the modernist, the mushy middle, who moves toward modernism. You have the fundamentalist. And there were three groups of fundamentalists. The ones were the stay-inners. These are my own terms. It's easier. The stay-inners. These are the people who were so committed to the fellowship, to the denomination, that even though they knew their denomination had gone completely liberal, they were going to stay in. And I've met people like that even today. No matter how doctrinally deviant their denomination gets, they don't believe in women preachers, they don't believe in gay preachers, they don't believe in a lot of this stuff, but they're going to keep going. There's my church, I'm going to keep going no matter what. The stay-inners. There weren't a lot of those, but there were some. The second were what I call the do-our-own-thingers. And the do-our-own-thingers were the ones that basically went back. They're not purely fundamentalists, but they decided to do their own thing. And the do-their-own-thingers became a part of the holiness churches that their story will come back up again. They become the Pentecostal churches. They just opt out of the debate altogether. They just quit. They said, okay, we're going to go do our own thing. And it became little offshoot denominations. The third were the Active Separators. And that's where the story then goes, with the Active Separators. The Active Separators, they did a number of different things. They went out and they went underground, we could say. Is that they stopped trying to influence the wider culture. They stopped trying to win the denominations, as I said. They stopped trying to save the seminaries, or certainly even the university. They just stopped. They said, well, we're not. That's not working. In fact, at that time, they said, we're not even going to go into politics anymore because that hadn't worked out real well for them. So they said, active separation. Well, what did they do actively? Well, I hate to leave you there because you're going to go eat lunch, and now you're going to come back after lunch, and you're going to be sleepy, and you'll fall asleep, and you're going to miss what I'm going to say about the Active Separators. So, but I'll have to chance it because we're down to the point where we will stop here. So I will take some questions if Aaron's ready on the microphone there to go around. So, any questions about this? Back. Again, Lori will have all your spellings for you up here front for your notes. Yes?
So it seems like the nature of the system is corrupted, like the churches keep swinging to the liberal side or whatever. So what is it about the nature that makes it corrupted, and how do we prevent against that? Like, is it too centralized? Like, oh, sorry. So what is it about the nature of the group or the church that makes it continually slide so that the mushy middle move?
Okay.
And how do we prevent against it without becoming just completely abandoning the...
All right, so that last little part is like a second question, so let me subdivide it, okay? First, how do I explain, what's the explanation for how this drift always keeps happening? Well, there are 5 passages in the book of Hebrews that you might want to go to, the warning passages there. It's all about the drift. You know, what happens in the drift. And, you could ask me and better ask your pastor about, what those 5 passages are. The drift seems to be sort of the inevitable. Well, why does drift seem to be the inevitable? One is we have an enemy who is relentless in opposing the church. And our enemy is going to continue to try in everything he possibly can to use whatever means he can to infiltrate the church, to destroy the church, to destroy any glory getting to Christ. So he is relentless. He prowls around as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. We need to take that seriously. We have a relentless enemy that's against us. The second thing is that we live in the church, even the church even the best of churches is a mixed body. Jesus said there's going to be, tares among the wheat. There always is. As I've said before, one of the problems with revivalism was it almost codified the notion that we could have people that are not really converted, but call them converted or think of them as full-fledged members of the church. You have people coming in. And those people, what they bring in is their fallenness among us. So it's there that things that appeal to the flesh are going to make sense to them, and things that appeal to the spirit won't make sense to them. And the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Which, quick story, that by the way, that I knew that verse before I knew John 3:16. I was dating this girl who was a Christian and I wasn't. And every time I went to her house, her mother would greet me at the door with, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked." I was there to date her daughter, and that's all I kept getting was, "The heart is deceitful above all things." I would say, "Nice to see you, Mrs. Hummel." Eventually, that woman became my mother-in-law, so it became a difficult sort of thing. But that's true. So we're falling. And the third thing is even if we are saved, there's the flesh. We still do that. I mean, you correctly perceive that it's stacked up against this, is it not? To try and maintain doctrinal purity and biblical fidelity, it's stacked up against this. We have the devil, we have the world, and we have the flesh. Or sometimes it's the world, the flesh, and the devil, or whatever order you want to put it in. That's stacked up against this. So what do we have? We have absolute, utter reliance on the Spirit of God and the Word of God, and that's it. We have to keep coming back to that. One of the things, again, that I sort of intimated with the fundamentalists is that there's a fundamental, no pun intended, lack of humility in then thinking that you can sort of say everything that you're for and everything that you're against. Because the idea there is that we're going to make it so clear, we're going to have things sound so solid, and we're going to be so pure that we're never going to have this problem again. So it's not a matter of sort of precluding the problems, it's constantly using the same cleansing agent in our lives, in our church, or if we're in one, a denomination, the same cleansing agent of the Spirit of God using the Word of God to do that to us. So we have to keep doing that. They just frankly are relentless. And again, I don't mean to be political, but the point is that this is what we're facing, I think, in this country. They are so relentless against a sort of Christian worldview that they keep pounding on it. And a lot of people think, well, what we need to do is accommodate it, or figure out how we can get along with them, or we can sort of do a political thing with this. I'm not suggesting we don't be political, but there's not going to be a political solution. That I'm going to be talking about this a bit tomorrow on the subject of persecution. We're going to have to learn that we're going to have to learn to deal with it, not expect that it's going to go away, or that we're going to defeat it in any way. We have to sort of deal with this, and we deal with it the same way. We deal with it by that. So this is the story of evangelicalism. Those four things, okay? You've seen so far, there's been attacks on every single one of them, haven't there been? Okay? That's the point. Those are the four things we keep coming back to. And I'll give you the conclusion of the entire day, because really by the final session you will be asleep, so I'll tell you what the conclusion is. The conclusion is that we have to keep coming back and coming back to those distinctives and saying, this is what we're all about, the gospel. We're all about changed lives. We're all about preaching the truth. There's where our activism is, not in fixing society. That's the activism. We have to stay true to the Bible and be humble when we're not, and confess it. See, that's, we got to have our own judgment. Begins in the household of God, and preach Christ. Preach Christ. Just keep preaching Christ, and in the end, we lose. Well, I mean on earth. But ultimately, we will win, right? But that's not going to be here. That's going to be with Christ. So, yeah. I mean, again, this is getting real political. Elect Larry Elder, if you can. But then do not believe that you're going to change a single thing about the state of California, okay? At the end of the day, you're going to move back to Iowa with me. Ever heard of Iowa nice? All the people are nice there. And the biggest traffic jam you have in Iowa is when the guy's got his combine on the 2-lane blacktop and you're stuck behind him. That's a traffic jam.